Hey everyone, I wanted to go through a few ways of bringing some life into your animation through the use of the graph editor and just understanding what keyframes do and how you can use them. Keyframes contain information about the property you're animating in After Effects. So what it does, it interpolates between the 2 points that you're changing. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about using the graph editor for making your animations look a little bit more lively. So we've just got a car here, so I'm going to press the P key and that'll just twirl down this position property, and I'm going to create a keyframe by just pressing the stopwatch. You can press Alt P or Option P, which does the same thing, and I'll just drag this timeline down to this point here, and then I'll drag this along to this point here. So you can see that, when it animates, it's just animating from one point to the next, but it's fairly static. Now what you'll see here is you've got this line here with the dots on it. Now these dots represent the frames, and they also represent the interpolation between or the easing between the beginning point and the end point. So at the moment it's a linear progression, so it's just going at a constant rate from point A to point B. So these dots will all remain equal. Now if we right click on our keyframe and go down to keyframe interpolation, what that shows us is that the temporal interpolation is linear and the spatial interpolation is linear as well. Now what that means is that interpolation is basically the change in value over that time. By temporal it means that this is over time, so we can either have it slow at the beginning or fast at the end, so we're controlling the time it takes to get from point A to point B. Now spatial interpolation refers to this line over here, so we can change the shape of that line so that our object can follow a different path. So this is like a motion path. If I use our Easy Ease, so I'll just go down here, right click and go to Keyframe Assistant and Easy Ease. Now you notice that the dots change a bit here, so these ones are closer together, goes further apart, and then so it should start off slower and then end up at a constant rate. So now if we right click and go to Keyframe Interpolation, it now says Bezier. So Bezier gives us control over how those frames are rendered. Okay, so let's just go through some of these keyframes and the different kinds of keyframes we can have. So if we right click on this one here, we've got a linear keyframe here, so the temporal interpolation is linear and the spatial interpolation's Bezier. Now this will be Bezier by default, and that's fine. I'll put a keyframe in the middle here, and so you can see that our dots here are all the same, so there's no change. But if we go to our graph editor, and we can see that all of a sudden we have and we right click on our interpolation, we have a linear keyframe. Now if we change that to a continuous Bezier, what that means is that it'll put handles either side. So if we control these handles, we can actually change the way the animation works across time. So now you can see that it's going slow, constant, and then slowing down into this point here. So there are lots of little frames there, means that it's going a bit slower. So let's just see how that looks. So you can see that it almost stops when it gets here and then continues on from there. So we can actually change the way this behaves a little bit too. So maybe it's going out fast, stopping, and then zipping through. We can change the value of this other keyframe here to a different kind of keyframe. So if we right click and go to making it a Bezier, you won't see much of a change. The main time that the Bezier handles will make the difference is if this is in a value graph. So let's just change this to separate dimensions, and we'll get rid of the Y value. So there's the X position there. So now you can see if we select this, so let's change that to a Bezier, and now you can see that we've got these independent handles. Just keep in mind that you can change these keyframes into whichever suits you best. So let's then just change it back to linear. Another thing that we can do is create hold frames. So with a hold frame, if I click here and say I want a keyframe there, and what I'm going to do is actually go to my keyframe interpolation, and instead of temporal, I'm going to put a hold frame there. So what a hold frame does, it maintains the same value as this keyframe until such point as it changes. So here you can see it's going to this point, so when it gets down here, this is a constant velocity, so it's not going to change, and it doesn't change the temporal position either. So it's just a hold. Now if you look at this line here, you can see that all of our frames are missing. So we've basically got a point here when it stops, and then a point here when it starts again. So we can change this to a hold frame. So you can actually just go toggle hold frame, and then what that does, that will just maintain that position right until the end. So I'm just going to create a whole bunch of hold frames. Okay, so this is used quite often for some stop motion. So if you want to stop something from moving, and then that will just stop it. So you can see that that's a different way of animating that particular object. Once again, once you've got these hold frames, you can just change them back to linear keyframes as well. So obviously it's fairly chunky, and if we go here and we change that to a linear, so make this instead of making the spatial interpolation linear, we then make that continuous Bezier. Now we've got a curve, so now we can go in here and adjust our handles. So you see, it's all about controlling the keyframes using those Bezier curves, paying attention to those dots to see how your interpolation's working across time. Now we've got our keyframe selected. I'll just move that out of the way. Now if we go up to our pen tool, which is G on the keyboard, and you'll see that when I roll over here, it changes to a manipulation icon, so that little angle bracket. So now if I click on that with that tool, you can see that I've got a handle here. So now if I drag that out, and we do the same over here, so what I'm doing is creating these handles by just clicking on this. So now you can see that we've got this path. Now this is your spatial interpolation. So this is where this Bezier curve controls the shape of this curve. So if we press play again, you can see that it's actually going from point A to point B and following that curve. But being a car, you don't really want it to sort of drive like that. So whenever you create a motion path, you can go up to your transform tool under layer, transform, and then go into auto orient, and we can actually say orient along path. Click OK, and now you see that when it animates, it's actually animating along that path. Okay, so you can see we're still getting some interpolation there. Now what we're going to do is look at the graph editor now. So the graph editor is a visual way that you can see those paths over time. So if I click on this little button down here, you can see that we've got this idea. We've got slow, ramping up, and then slow again. Now the graph editor has a couple of different graphs that you can use to change your interpolation. So at the moment this is what's called a speed graph. So a speed graph is used when your property, like for example your position, has two values. So if we change this to the other graph, which is called a value graph, so I'll just show you that quickly. So edit value graph, and now you can see that we've got two values that are changing over time. Now in order to control this, it can be a little bit tricky because I can't actually separate them to control these curves. Okay, so when I select it, they're both selected because we're changing two properties. So quite often if you go to auto select, this is our what's called a speed graph. So if we right click, so I'm just holding down the command key or control so that we don't delete that key. If I right click and go to keyframe interpolation, we've got Bezier and we've got continuous Bezier for the spatial. So continuous Bezier we can control in our timeline up here. So we're not controlling the speed of that. So if we make this, to frame these up in that window, you just hit that little button down here. Now you can see that we basically have a constant velocity. So notice that our keyframes now, up here, our spatial interpolation, you can see that these dots are the same space again because we're not changing velocity over that time. But if I take this and drag that in that way and drag this one down here, okay, our speed graph is showing that it's going slow, ramping up fast, and then slowing right down. And the way to really look at that is if you look at these dots, how close they are. So you see over here that they're really close together. So the more frames that you have over that given distance, the more frames, the slower the animation. So when you have a big gap between these frame points here, then you're going to go a lot faster. So if we render that now, you can see that it's much more fluid and a much nicer curve. Let's just bring that back to straight. So we can adjust our spatial interpolation. So now, even though we've moved this spatial positioning, the motion path, you can see that we're still getting a nice easing of those elements. When you have two values in here, so for example the position property as it is there, and also the scale property, for example, I have to go back to my keyframes here. So I'm going to change this. So let's make that big, really big there, and then reducing down to there. So when it gets over here, so now we can see that you can do the same. So if we look at our graph, you notice here that our scale is very linear. So it's going from this value down to that value in a straight line. So if this line's straight, then that's a constant velocity. So what we can do is actually, if we just select one of these, and go to our speed graph, so now we can see that if we change our speed graph, so it should scale really fast and then slow into this movement. So this is like a visual representation of how that's going from that to that. Sometimes, when you know that you're only changing the X value, we can actually right click on here, or you can click on this little button down here. What that does, that separates the dimensions. So now, because we're not changing the Y position, we can actually turn those keyframes off. Now with your speed graph, it doesn't look quite the same because you're only doing one value. So this is where we can go to the value graph, and what that does, that shows you how that is changing over time from point A to point B. And this curve shows you that it's sort of starting off a little bit fast, so it goes kind of chunky, slows down, and then hits fast. So you can see that by the dots. So you can see there's a big jump from the start point to this point. So let's just have a look at that. So it starts quick and then ends quick. So we can change this curve, so we can actually make it go, sort of ease in quickly, slow down, but then when it gets to the end, we won't want it to go really slow. So obviously this time over this time it's only moving in value very small amounts. So you can see that at the end here it's really compressed. So if we look at that, so it'll start fast and then really ease in slowly. It's just a way of giving a little bit more life to your animations so that they don't appear to be so linear. Obviously, if you're doing something like a machine that has a very robotic kind of movement, then linear keyframes are perfectly fine. And by changing this curve, we can actually change the way that animation works. And if we just hold the command key down and click, it'll change it back to a linear keyframe. Okay, so now it's just doing the same thing over that time. I'm going to turn off separate dimensions, so we've just got the one property again. So let's zoom out a bit here, and let's say we want to do this kind of curve thing. So instead of our animation finishing at this point, we want that to finish over there. Okay, so if I have separate dimensions, so here we can go, so now I've got an X and Y value. If I want to change that spatial interpolation, and I move this over here, drag that down there. Okay, so we're doing this kind of idea where we can crash at the end. If we look at our curve, you can see kind of what a mess this becomes, because we have all these different things to control. So our X and Y is based on that, and we might want to change it this way, that way. So it really becomes quite messy. So I'll just go back. Okay, so I'm just going from in a linear fashion here. I'm going to, because they're separate, what I'll do, instead of using the value graph, I'm going to swap it over to the speed graph. Now at the moment it's just a constant speed. So let's drag that up there. I probably should bring that down there. Okay, so now you can see that our animation's kind of chunky, because you can see that it's just doing constant velocity between all these points. Now we can fix that a little bit by changing these. If I press G for the pen tool, we can make that into more of a curve. Okay, so now you can see that it's a bit better, but we can control the speed, but really we want a constant speed. So this temporal interpolation, we really want that to be a consistent speed, because if we start editing these, once again we've kind of got this, we're moving the spatial interpolation as well, so we're moving the that motion path at the same time, which we don't necessarily want. So there's a little thing that you can do. So if we select both of these keyframes, so that's this one here and this one, and we right click and we say rove across time. Alright, so what that does, if you look at the graph now, you can see that our keyframes actually become part of this path. So remember before they were actually separate sort of speed graphs, so that's why I had that stair step effect. Okay, so now you'll see that it should just go constant over time. So what we're doing is actually altering this path, and we're just doing it in a temporal way. So if we want to slow it down at the end, these keyframes are actually part of this path. So that means that they're not actually, you're not changing the temporal interpolation. You can change the spatial interpolation, but you're not changing the temporal interpolation. So you can see it goes really quick. So let's just make that a little bit more sensible. So now you can see it's going to go really slow, zoom up super fast, and then slow right down again. Yeah, so you hardly even see it. Let's change this value a bit, and let's just even things out a little bit. So let's just make that slow down at the top and then go down to the bottom, and we should be able to get it to be a little bit more smooth. By doing these keyframes as roving across time, we take them out of that temporal interpolation, and we just use that for spatial values now. So if we want to change the spatial values of these, we can just select our curve, change the way that the spatial interpolation. So I guess that's just the main difference between temporal interpolation and spatial interpolation, and how we can use them to rove our keyframes across time. And it's a really useful skill to know.